The Lost and Drowned by Stuart. With every snowflake that fell across London's narrow cobbled streets, Lydia felt the chill of her own death creep closer. Despite the cold, her woolen vest was wet with sweat. She lay there wide-eyed, too scared to sleep, terrified of what her dreams might mean. Dirty hair was matted to her pale skin, and her panicked breaths rose like ghosts into the gloom above the cobweb-festooned rafters. She wiped the hair from her eyes and felt tears cut through the thin layers of grime on her cheeks, streaking her face. Snow was building up on the window ledges, darkening the already murky dormitory. Outside, the wind shrieked down the lane like a mournful spirit. Winter had returned, bringing back nightmares that Lydia had spent a year trying to forget. Images of the missing girls held captive by something terrible that lay hidden in the darkness, drowning in filthy waters. Bleary-eyed and yawning, her little sister sat up next to her. "You all right?" Sophie asked, pulling the thin blanket back around them both. "Have you even slept yet?" Lydia nodded and tried to smile, her green eyes wide and awake. Her heart was still hammering so loudly, she was sure her sister must be able to hear it. Even as she blinked, the images of the dead girls' sunken faces flashed in front of her. Shaking, Lydia took Sophie's outstretched hand and gave each finger a kiss. "Did Mother used to kiss her fingers like that?" Sophie asked, laying back down again, the caress seeming to spark some long-forgotten sensation. Lydia watched her sister's chest rise and fall as Sophie began to fall back to sleep, not waiting for an answer. Such a fragile-looking thing, Lydia thought, like a baby bird that had fallen out of the nest too early. Sophie's red hair, which refused to be dulled with the grime of the mill and orphanage, hung over the bed like a scarlet waterfall, and her ivory skin glowed with an almost ghostly luminescence in the dark. "Maybe. I think so," Lydia said, unsure, more to herself than to Sophie, questioning her own recollections. Every winter it had become more difficult to distinguish between the real memories of her mother and those that she had made up to fight back the despair that often rose like a dark cloud around her. There were so many things that she was now no longer sure had actually happened. Had her mother's smiling lips and cheeks been as rosy as she pictured? Did her mother really pick Lydia up and dance around the front room singing nursery rhymes, or had she invented that? Had she really spent her mother's final few minutes promising her she would always look after Sophie? Was that something she had made up to her wild sister to try and calm her down so many times that she now believed it? A crackle in the fire distracted her, and she turned to watch the lone weak flame splutter and disappear. The embers burnt orange, then pink before turning to a dull grey ash. Despite the cold of their room, Lydia felt a strange new chill creep under the door and through the dormitory. She sat up and stared in terror. Leaving a silvery trail on the stone floor and over the legs of the bed, a path of frost twisted and turned about the room, moving, not naturally like a breeze from a window, but like a sentient predator, like a snake winding its way around a nest of baby mice. All the warmth was sucked from the room. The only sound was the crackle of frost forming on the stone floor. Lydia tried to rub some warmth back into her scrawny arms as she stared transfixed at the trail of ice that wound its way towards her. She grabbed her blanket and pulled it over her and her sister. Squeezing her eyes as tightly shut as she could, she hugged her sister and prayed they would both make it until morning. "Please not again, please not again, not my sister, not her," she panted in feeble, stuttering whispers. She lay there for a minute until she was relieved to feel the warmth seep back into the room. Lydia edged the blanket down and peeked around, ready to dive back under cover if she saw something. Nothing. Everything was as it should have been. "We've all survived," Lydia thought to herself. But then she noticed it. Harriet's bed was empty. She bolted over to where her friend's blanket lay crumpled on her mattress and tugged at fistfuls of her own hair. 2 wet footprints, still half frozen, stood facing Harriet's bed. Panicked, Lydia checked under Harriet's empty bunk, then the next bed and the next, pulling off covers until she had looked in every dark corner and under all 27 beds. "No, no, no, this isn't happening again," she stammered, her voice close to breaking. Sophie bolted out of bed and ran up to her, wrapping the blanket around her sister's bony shoulders. "What's wrong, Lydia? You're scaring me." Lydia darted back across the stone cobbles to Isabel, the eldest of the girls who was still sleeping soundly. She shook her by the shoulders and Isabel woke, her big brown eyes peering blearily up at Lydia from under a mop of black, wiry hair. She clutched Lydia's arm with icy fingers. "Harriet's gone," Lydia said, and swallowed back the dread that dried her throat. It was the day she'd been fearing for almost 11 months, the day she hoped and prayed would never come again. Isabel sat up and pulled her frizzy hair back into a ponytail. "Are you sure, Lydia? Maybe—" But Lydia cut her off. "She's gone. Harriet's gone." By now, all the girls in the dormitory were awake, their eyes wide and fearful. Even those girls that hadn't been at Rotten Hall Orphanage in previous winters had heard the stories. There wasn't an orphan in the whole of London that hadn't listened to the rumours of girls who were sleeping peacefully one moment, then gone the next. Girls disappearing without a trace. The orphans looked now to Lydia and Isabel. Lydia knew that death and fear were no strangers to these girls. They had watched their mothers and sisters coughing up blood, had seen friends trampled by horses and dragged into weaving looms. But the winter brought with it something far worse. Lydia put an arm around Sophie, who had begun to sob, and pulled her tight. "How am I going to keep you safe?" she whispered. Soon, other girls around her began to cry too, and panic spread through the dormitory like a contagious disease. The commotion brought Mrs. Bloater waddling into the room, the fat under her arm swinging long after she came to an abrupt stop. "What on earth is all this noise about?" she croaked, her fat neck wobbling like a greying blancmange. Shadows thrown from the lamp in her podgy hand made her warty face look even more grotesque than normal. "It's Harriet, madam. She's gone," Lydia said, looking at the floor. "Well, where's she gone?" the cook asked, gazing about the room. There was no response. "I said, where's she gone? She can't just be lost. One of you little brats knows where she's run off to." The girls were silent, and a grimace spread across Mrs. Bloater's swollen face as she wiped her nose with her sleeve and waddled over to Lydia and Isabel. "Perhaps one of you knows where she is. What about you, Isabel, our little dark-skinned mulatto? Do you know where she's gone? Or you, Lydia? I bet you know where she's hiding." Lydia struggled to bite back her retort. "She's gone for tea at the Ritz," is what she really wanted to say, but sarcasm would only get Sophie hurt. Well, we'll see what Mr. Scrivet thinks about all this when he gets back," Mrs. Bloater sneered as she squeezed her enormous frame out of the door and into the corridor. For a moment, Lydia was confused as to why on earth Mr. Scrivet was not asleep in his room upstairs, and wondered why he'd be out at this late time of night. But her confusion was quickly replaced by a fresh fear. She might not know where Mr. Scrivet was, but she knew exactly what he would think when he got back. He would think they all deserved a beating for being out of bed after curfew. Some of the girls got back into their bunks and pulled the covers over them, trying to be as small and insignificant as possible, hoping that Mr. Scrivet might not notice them when he came thundering in. Despite her exhaustion, Lydia was far too heartbroken and frightened to even consider trying to sleep again. Harriet had been one of her best friends since she had arrived 5 years ago. She was the kind of girl that would save you some bread from her own measly rations if Mrs. Bloater decided it would be funny to knock your plate over and step on your food. She had found enough scraps of material at the mill to start making and repairing other girls' socks, and never asked for anything in return. And now she was gone. In less than a minute she had disappeared from their lives. If she was to share the same fate as the other girls the previous year, she would never be seen again.